Please turn with me in your Bibles to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 5. This is Jesus' so-called Sermon on the Mount. We'll be looking at verses 13 through 16 and concluding our series on how we change, the means of grace that God uses to change us, to grow us up, to make us more and more like Jesus. The last three messages in this series are the arenas of change, looking at the arena of our possessions, of our passions, and today, our positions and our powers, our arenas of impact and influence. And so let's give our attention to the reading of God's holy word, found in Matthew 5, verse 13. You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet. You're the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, and it gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. Years ago, a survey was taken of the religiously unaffiliated in a community probably much like our own. There were a number of questions, and one of the questions was, what are you looking for from the church or from Christians? These were the religiously unaffiliated people to whom the survey was addressed. And the surveyors summarized the answer in two words. Prove it. What they were saying to the church, to the Christian community, is be what you proclaim to be. And a concise rendering of this section, verses 13 through 16 in Matthew 5, could be something like this. Be an obvious Christian. Be an obvious Christian. You see, in the first 10 verses, the so-called Beatitudes, Jesus gives the distinguishing character of his disciples. And then in these verses 13 through 16, he describes the dynamic change through his disciples. So in the first 10 verses, we have the identity of kingdom citizens. And here in these verses, we have the influence of kingdom citizens. Influence or impact flows out of identity. It's who we are that determines what we do. Which means, therefore, that the heart, who we are, is the heart of the matter. But when we have heart, we will impart something to others. C.S. Lewis was right when he said, the best argument for Christianity is Christians. Their joy, their certainty, their completeness. But the best argument against Christianity is also Christians. When they are somber and joyless, when they are self-righteous and smug, when they are narrow and repressive, then Christianity dies 1,000 deaths. People are watching. And the world evaluates Christ, unfortunately, not as much by the Bible and its record of who Jesus is, but the world tends to evaluate Jesus more by his church, his people, those who profess to know him. Now, in this passage, Jesus uses two metaphors. It's obvious, the metaphor of salt and the metaphor of light. I'm continually learning about new American slang. Did you know that salty, and I'm told this is the result of the gaming community, means something very different than what Jesus depicts in this passage? A salty person is an angry and hostile person. I guess a person who produces salt from other people's eyes is the idea. I don't know. But anyway, forget about that slang as we look at what Jesus is saying here. Salt and light. And the first thing, we see some lessons here from these metaphors, lessons for the world. Jesus is describing our influence or our impact in light of the world's need. And so there are two things about the world's desperate need that Jesus is emphasizing here. First of all, the world is marked by decay. The world is in moral and spiritual putrefaction, if you will, and it needs a preservative. That was one of the primary uses, not the only one, but one of the primary uses of salt in the ancient world. They didn't have refrigeration, so salt was used as a preservative for many things, especially food. But secondly, not only decay, but darkness. Jesus is communicating that the world is in darkness, in moral and spiritual ignorance and deception, and needs light. It needs a preservative because of its decay. It needs light because of its darkness. So Jesus is saying here, human society, without my influence through you, my people, is the moral and spiritual equivalent of a rotting carcass or a very dark cave. Corruption, decay, confusion, darkness mark the world. Now, this is a sobering but realistic appraisal on Jesus' part of the moral and spiritual condition of this fallen world. Biblical history, secular history, uniformly chronicles the world's proneness to become foul and to putrefy, and the world's proneness to stumble, blindly groping for answers and always coming up empty-handed. So the world's need is pictured. That's the first lesson here, a lesson for the world itself concerning its condition and need. Some of you who are students of history will know that the 19th century was the century of optimism. It was an optimism, many believe, that was fueled by evolutionary theory, coming from Darwin, but then there were the social Darwinists who applied Darwinian evolution to man and his condition, and many were proposing that soon we're going to abolish war and disease and poverty and oppression and injustice, and the technological, the industrial boom that was bringing with it, the technological boom was going to bring all kinds of inconveniences that would shorten our work week, that was going to end life was going to be easier. 19th century optimism, and then came the 20th century. The bloodiest century in the history of the world. Poverty and human misery on a staggering scale, brutalities, barbarities, and inhumanities. For many people, living in the 20th century was living in an interminable horror flick, and the 21st century has pretty much continued the trend. But if you're also a student of history, you know that this was not brand new. It was just an increase on what was already there. In fact, early in the 18th century, London, England, was a veritable Sodom and Gomorrah. Did you know that? And what was needed was a massive spiritual salt down to preserve it from the advanced stages of moral and spiritual decay. Enter the 18th century revival and spiritual awakening that especially swept through the English-speaking world in Britain and the colonies, but also spread throughout much of the known world. Literally saving the world from sinking irreparably into the advanced stages of spiritual rottenness and darkness. Did you know that in America, in the American colonies, that in just a few short years, 10% of the American colonies were converted? And we're talking about real, serious conversions, on fire Christians who multiplied then and basically paved the way for what this nation became. So here's the thing, though. If you evaluate where we are now, don't we feel kind of spiritually marginalized? We feel impotent before this exploding pagan consensus, like a shrinking minority. And the world seems to be becoming even more hostile toward us. And if not hostile, at least indifferent. And here's the question. Can we make a difference? Can we have an impact? Well, let me tell you something. Based on these few verses, Jesus is not skeptical about our potential. You are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. The salt of the earth, not of your little corner in no man's land, the backwater of the Roman Empire, this little place called Judea. You're the salt of the earth. You're the light of the whole world. To this little band of peasants, Jesus says, you are my method for changing the world. So there are lessons, as we can see, for the world from these two metaphors, but as I just said latterly, we see that there are lessons also for us as Christians. The first lesson is the lesson concerning our significance, our value, which means that we're God's ordained antidote to the meaninglessness of this fallen world. You may or may not know this, but in the ancient world, salt was highly valued. The Greeks called it divine dust, and the Roman soldiers were actually often paid in salt, and that's where we get the word salary. It comes from a Latin word, salary, saline, salt. They were paid in salt, and that's where we also get the expression, he or she is not worth their salt, not worth their payment. And so what Jesus is saying here, it's glorious for you to be a Christian, to belong to me. You and you only, that's the emphasis of the Greek grammar there. You and you only are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. So we're custom designed by God to be futility busters, emptiness dispellers. Recently, Jenny and I have had the privilege of getting to know our neighbors better. More on that later. But so we have to do everything outside, like we're tonight going to be outside. And so we're outside on our patio and hanging out with a couple of our neighbors. And in the process, there's some unburdening of deep concern about health challenges for one of them personally, but also for even more for a dear friend. Tremendous health challenges. And you can almost feel as the conversation goes that weight of the futility and the emptiness there. And so we had the privilege of living into that with them and seeking to fill some of that emptiness and to dispel some of that sense of futility. But not only does the metaphor point to our significance, it points to the fact that we are to manifest savor. Salt, obviously, both in the ancient world and especially in the modern world, is not only a preservative, but it was also the number one condiment, the number one seasoner in food in most of the cultures of both the ancient and the modern world. Paul, you remember, uses this same metaphor in Colossians 4 when he speaks of our speech as Christians. He says, "Speak always with grace. Let your speech be seasoned, as it were, with salt." Now apply that in our current situation. I think every single one of us are in touch with the fact that we're living in a time of outrage and hatred and division in our country. And you know, we can't wave a wand over that and fix a lot of that, but can't we be purveyors in the way we speak into this outraged and hatred-filled world? Can't we be purveyors of kindness and charity? We don't have to buckle on our positions, but how we enter the discussion and how we conduct ourselves. So, we are to be the antidote to a tasteless, drab, and bland life. Christians are to bring zest, savor, flavor to the problem of pervasive boredom and aimlessness and futility and tedium. But often we fail at that. The early 20th century jurist Oliver Wendell Holmes said, "I might have entered the ministry if certain clergymen I knew had not looked and acted so much like undertakers." God forgive us. Christian presence is meant to make life more palatable. But the tediousness of life is eliminated only as the thirst for the Lord is elevated. Tedium is eliminated only as thirst is elevated. You've heard the old saying, you can take a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. Somebody added, yeah, but you can give him salt tablets. We're to be God's salt tablets, if you will. Do I provoke spiritual thirst in others? We've all been around people who did that for us. Just being with certain people, you felt the pull. You could sense the authenticity of their walk with God. And you were just like sucked into the afterdraft of their spiritual chariot, as it were. Disciples of Jesus are to create thirst for God in others by virtue of our own authentic intimacy with Christ. So significance is one of the lessons of the metaphor. Savor is the second lesson of the metaphor, but also this sanitation lesson. We're to be the antidote to impurity. We're to have an antiseptic impact. We are to be, for example, the epitome of honesty and integrity in an economic system virtually built on lies. The mass media extols the excitement of sexual looseness, and our lives are to be the models of sexual and moral purity. Disciples are designed by God to preserve the world from its propensity to decay. Again, building on the illustration I used earlier, French culture in the early 18th century. French culture was sinking into that similar moral rottenness that was going on in Britain. But they did not experience the antiseptic impact of a moral and spiritual revival and awakening. And as a result, when political trouble hit and that revolution came, then France was torn to shreds. Across the Channel, on the other hand, as Britain was sinking into a similar moral rottenness, she didn't collapse. Was it because of her superior navy, or because of her superior diplomacy, or greater political system, or their police force? No, it was because in 1703, a little baby boy was born by the name of John Wesley. And 11 years later, another little baby boy by the name of George Whitefield was born, who became, the two of them, firm, fast, lifelong friends. And they became the human mouthpieces of God to preach the gospel in open fields to thousands and thousands of people all over Britain, all over the American colonies. Empires seldom crumble from without, but they crumble from within. Where is the preservative today? Where is the church? Even the society is in effect saying to us, be an obvious Christian. Prove it. Finally, we see as a lesson of these metaphors for us Christians is we are to shine. We're to be the antidote to deception, to delusion, to unbelief. God has no Secret Service agents. As Robert Louis Stevenson said, we are designed by God to poke holes in the darkness, to shine. Before Woodrow Wilson became president, he was a younger man, and he was in a barber shop one day getting his hair cut. And all of a sudden, he was aware of an unusual presence in the room. A man came in, sat in the chair beside him, also to get a haircut. And he, while he was being attended to, Woodrow Wilson said that he could tell that this man had tremendous, focused interest in the one who was cutting his hair. You just feel that to an unusual degree. And after a while, he said, I felt like I was attending an evangelistic service. I purposely lingered in the room after this amazing person left and noted the singular effect of that his visit had brought upon the barber shop. I later learned the name of the man, D.L. Moody, the great American 19th century evangelist. The others in the room didn't know his name, but they knew something had elevated their thoughts, and I felt that I left that place as I would have if I left a place of profound worship. You know what's odd about Jesus calling us the light of the world? He calls himself the light of the world. Do you remember that? So which is it? In John's Gospel, chapter 8, Jesus says, I am the light of the world. Well, the point is that our light is borrowed light. We're like the moon. He's like the sun. We just reflect his light. Paul the Apostle, picking up on this theme in Ephesians 5, verse 8, says, you were formerly darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. But there's a warning in this passage. A warning concerning saltless salt and hidden light. Do you see that in verse 13? And then again in verse 15? You see, salt preempts the spread of evil. That's the negative side. But light promotes the spread of good. That's the positive side. Salt is a metaphor for the quiet influences of godly character, showing the gospel. But light is the dazzling public influence of vigorous witness, sharing the gospel. The gospel must be shown, deed, and shared, word. But evidently we can lose our power to influence. The world can influence the church more than the church is influencing the world. That's saltless salt and hidden light. What is the application of all of this? Let me just suggest a few things. This is not going to cover the subject by any stretch, but a few suggested application points. The first thing is that salt and light must become proximate to the need. Salt has to be where the rottenness is. Light has to come into where the darkness is. We need to be insulated from the rottenness and the darkness, but not isolated from it. We need to have contact without contamination. How many Christians complain about having to work somewhere in a job where they're surrounded by unbelievers? We ought to celebrate that. There are no Christians at my job. Wall to wall, carpeted with lost people. Awesome. Great opportunity. I am completely immersed in it. I'm swimming through an ocean of need. How different those perspectives are. Yes, we're to be different, but not detached. We're not of the world, but we must be in it. Somebody's used the illustration of a scuba diver. A scuba diver is completely surrounded by the element, but drawing his or her breath from a different atmosphere, from another realm. Too many of us are safely stored in salt warehouses. Becky Pippert wrote a book years ago, Out of the Salt Shaker and Into the World. We become useless salt if we're not out there. And sure, if we lose our uniqueness, our impact will diminish. But often our impact diminishes because we're simply not where the action is. We're spiritually AWOL. Absent without leave. Now, whose fault is it, by the way, if the light doesn't shine? Is it the world's fault? The darkness of Mammoth Cave cannot extinguish the light. No one has ever smothered the light by increasing the darkness. In fact, the darker the place, the more obvious the light is. We can't blame the darkness for our failure to shine. How many Christians are running around cursing the darkness more than they are casting a light? John Stott said, when society does go bad, we tend to throw up our hands in pious horror and reproach the non-Christian world. But should we not rather reproach ourselves? One can hardly blame unsalted meat for going bad. It cannot do anything else. The real question is, where's the salt? So, the conclusion is that both salt and light must make contact. To exert influence, there must be contact. Are we making every effort to be near, around, with pre-Christians. If we could have a spiritual stethoscope to listen in on the heart of God, boom, boom, with every beat of the divine heartbeat, we would hear, people, people, people. I mean, just look at Jesus. He ate in their homes. He went to their parties. He talked to them on their streets. He reached out and touched them with his love. He met Peter at the dock. He met the woman of Samaria at the town well. He met Matthew at his tax office. He met Zacchaeus up a tree. He was in the streets. He was out in the fields. In fact, he was so up to his armpits in people that occasionally he was still human, remember, as well as divine. He had to run and escape just to catch his breath, to rejuvenate, to enter back in. Well, we're in a pandemic. You say, well, Pastor, what do we do now? We're isolated from each other, much less from lost people. The pandemic has sent us home. Guess what's at home? Our neighbors. What are they doing? They're bored out of their minds. They're lonely. I can't believe we're walking more, even in the heat. You wait till the sun goes down, it's not too bad. We're walking more, we're meeting more of our neighbors. We can hardly get through our walk from meeting, talking. And then I've complained to God about this, and I should stop. I got on our homeowners association, note to self, avoid that. But anyway, you know, with a lot of difficult things, there are good things. And in the process, I'm meeting all kinds of people. And I'm having to diffuse a lot of anger. And so I'm having to enter in and try to be some salt and some light. And people are afraid right now. What is the great fear buster? It's faith. Who has faith? Or at least we profess to have it. I heard about one of you that is really good about meeting your neighbors, and I'm not going to embarrass anybody here, but I heard that what you did, you said, well, why don't we just have an ice cream social out on our back porch? And so they came. What else are they going to do? So they show up, social distance, but ice cream, talking, being with each other. Turn on the porch light. Turn on the Jesus light. So we've got to be proximate to the need, but also we've got to authentically bear the name. In this world that's binged on and bored by and cynical about image over substance, someone comes along and models authenticity, it's going to stand out like a light in the darkness. Listen, the world doesn't need any more slick marketeers of religious products and services. We are to be living proof of a loving God to a watching world. Write that down. I want you to say it with me. Living proof of a loving God to a watching world. Living proof of a loving God to a watching world. We could almost make that a motto or a mission, I don't know, mission statement or something. But that authenticity has to be rooted in integrity, the integrity of our nature. If you'll notice the passage that follows, In verses 21 to 26, he focuses on relationships. In verses 27 to 30, he focuses on sexual purity. In verses 31 to 37, he focuses on faithfulness to promises. And then in verses 38 to 48, he really hits it, love for your enemies. So when the light is shining, here's what happens. People don't get preoccupied with the light, but with that which the light illumines, which is what? Christ. They see him. That's why in verse 16 he says, let your light shine so that they will think you are just terrific. Is that what he says? No, he says, so that they will praise or glorify your Father who is in heaven. When people don't extol the light, they enjoy being illumined. People don't praise the salt, they enjoy the meal. They're not so much aware of us. They're aware that God is alive. He's real. The world doesn't say, wow, you're a great church. They say, wow, you have a great God. I close with a searching question posed by Robert Lewis, the pastor, or was the pastor of Fellowship Bible Church in Little Rock, Arkansas. He asked his church this question, and I ask us this question. If we disappeared tomorrow, would it matter to this community? Would they even notice that we're no longer here? Let's be salty, not in the modern slang, but let's be salty like Jesus. Let's be brilliantly shining. Let's be obvious Christians. Let's pray. Lord, we're about to sing how you heard people's cry. Give us ears to hear. How those dwelling in darkness and sin were enabled to see the light. Make us light. We're going to sing about how you have borne our pain and wept for love of us and others. How you broke our hearts of stone in the hearts of others. How you gave your life. Lord, enable us to pray as Isaiah did, here am I. Send me. I will go. I will hold your people in my heart. Amen. Let's stand as we sing that to ourselves and back to God. Here am I, Lord. Let's stand as we sing.